Ethan Turner stood in front of his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling cityscape that stretched endlessly beneath the soft glow of the setting sun. His penthouse was a reflection of his success. Clean lines, expensive decor, and a minimalist style that screamed wealth without ever needing to boast. The sharp angles of the buildings, the buzz of cars below, and the distant hum of city life all seemed to create a symphony of noise. Yet inside his glass and steel fortress, all was quiet. Almost too quiet. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, the gesture a habitual release of tension. At 42, Ethan had everything a man could want. A multi-million-dollar empire built from the ground up, a portfolio of properties that spanned continents, and a reputation that earned him invitations to elite circles. He didn't need to worry about money, nor did he ever have to chase after dreams. His life had been shaped by the kind of ambition that no amount of wealth could fully satisfy. For years, he prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his existence: his work, his relationships, his environment. He was the master of his own destiny. But as he gazed out across the glittering skyline, the weight of silence pressed on him more than usual. There were no sounds of children laughing, no voices echoing from the hallway, no warmth from someone waiting for him to return home. His life, he realized, had become a carefully curated collection of material possessions and professional achievements. And yet, in this moment of calm, something felt missing. Ethan had always told himself he didn't need anyone. He thrived on independence, the kind that only wealth could buy. He could travel whenever he wanted, dine in the finest restaurants, and take business calls from the comfort of his expansive home office. Relationships had been fleeting at best, romantic encounters that lasted only as long as the thrill of the chase. Relationships where affection was exchanged with the same transactional efficiency that governed his business deals. The women he dated were beautiful, yes, but none of them had ever come close to making him feel the kind of connection that could disrupt his well-ordered world. Still, even Ethan couldn't ignore the growing discontent that had started to gnaw at him, a sensation he didn't quite understand but couldn't push away. On paper, his life was perfect. He was the man everyone envied, the kind of man who had it all, who had figured out the equation of success, the secret to living a life without regret. And yet, when he sat alone in his apartment at the end of a long day, he wondered if the price of his success had been the quiet loneliness that now echoed through his carefully constructed life. His mind wandered back to his childhood, to memories of family dinners, of laughter and arguments shared at the table, of the feeling of being rooted in a place where people mattered more than business deals. But that had been so long ago. He had long since severed the ties that connected him to those simpler days, choosing the cold, logical world of high finance over the warmth of human connection. He convinced himself it was the better choice, that the sacrifices were worth it. But now, standing in the softening light of his penthouse, the emptiness of his life felt more real than ever. The truth was, he had grown accustomed to the idea that relationships were nothing more than distractions. People came and went, as fleeting as the moments they occupied. Even his closest friends were just names in a phone book, people he saw at events or invited to business functions, but rarely someone he shared an authentic moment with. He told himself that he didn't need anyone to complete him. His empire was enough. Yet, that same empire felt strangely cold when he thought about how few people truly knew him. How few people had seen beyond the polished exterior and the powerful man he projected to the world. Ethan had made a point to keep his emotions under lock and key, and it worked. His personal life had been a revolving door of people who never asked too many questions, never lingered long enough to expose the deeper parts of himself. It was easier that way, cleaner. No messy attachments, no emotional baggage. But as the city lights flickered beneath him, the thought that had been tugging at him for weeks resurfaced, one that Ethan had tried to ignore. Is this all there is? There was a part of him that wondered if he had somehow missed out on something more, something deeper than his towering ambitions. A part of him, one that he quickly pushed aside, longed for the kind of intimacy he saw others experience, the easy companionship that came from a shared life, the kind of connection where two people could navigate the world together. But no matter how hard he tried to push the thought away, it lingered, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Shaking his head, Ethan turned from the window and walked to the bar. He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking softly as he filled the glass with the rich amber liquid. A quick gulp, and the warmth of the scotch spread through his chest, momentarily dulling the ache of loneliness. He had always told himself that he didn't need anyone, that he was enough. But tonight, for some reason, he wasn't so sure. As he set the glass down and sat on the leather sofa, he realized that he had spent so many years chasing after the wrong things. He had chased money, power, influence, assuming they would fill whatever void had slowly crept into his life. But none of them had. They were just distractions. He knew it, but he didn't know how to fix it. His life had been carefully constructed to keep the real questions at bay. But now, for the first time in a long while, those questions were too loud to ignore. The sharp buzz of his phone broke through the silence, jolting him back to reality. It was an invitation, another gala, another networking opportunity. He could already hear the names of the movers and shakers of the business world, the polished smiles and business card exchanges. A part of him considered tossing the phone aside, but instead he hesitated. As his fingers hovered over the screen, an unexpected thought crossed his mind. Maybe I need to get out of here for a while. Maybe I need to stop hiding behind all of this and see something real for once. He took another sip of scotch and stared out the window. The city was still alive, bustling with activity, full of people rushing to their own destinations, lost in their own struggles. Perhaps, just maybe, there was a way for him to become part of that life again. Not the life of a businessman, but of a person seeking connection. Ethan had never been one to believe in love at first sight. He had always seen relationships as temporary, something to be enjoyed in fleeting moments of passion, but never something to be built upon or invested in for the long haul. His past had taught him that people were ultimately unreliable. Relationships came with strings attached, and attachments, he believed, made people weak. But that evening at the charity gala, when he first met Sophia Brooks, he couldn't deny that something shifted within him. She stood near the refreshment table, laughing softly at something one of the older women beside her had said. Her dark hair cascaded in loose waves around her shoulders, her eyes sparkling with a genuine warmth that contrasted sharply with the colder, more calculated expressions of the other women around her. Sophia was not the type to stand out in a crowd of wealthy elites. She didn't wear the latest designer dress or the most dazzling jewelry. Her dress was simple, classically cut in a muted green that complemented her skin tone. And yet, she had an undeniable presence. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but she did. Ethan found himself gravitating toward her, drawn by an inexplicable force. He didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was the way she moved through the room with an ease that suggested she was comfortable with who she was, or the lightness of her laughter, which felt like a contrast to the uptight, self-conscious conversations happening around him. When their eyes met, it wasn't the usual glimmer of recognition or the instant spark of attraction that Ethan had become accustomed to. It was something more subtle, a quiet understanding that neither of them could quite articulate at that moment. Care for a drink? Ethan asked smoothly, his voice calm, almost casual, as he approached her. Sophia turned to face him, her eyes briefly assessing him before a small, amused smile appeared on her lips. Sure, but only if you promise not to offer me one of those sugary cocktails they serve at these things. Her tone was light, but there was a quiet strength in it, as though she wasn't interested in the usual pleasantries. Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her directness. I think I can manage that, he said with a smile. I'm Ethan, by the way. Sophia, she replied, shaking his hand, her grip firm yet gentle. There was no false warmth, no forced charm. Just an honest, real exchange that immediately felt different from the superficial conversations Ethan was used to having. The conversation that followed was surprisingly easy. They talked about the gala, about the charity it was supporting, and slowly about their lives. Sophia revealed that she was a freelance graphic designer, a single mother of 3, and that she'd been divorced for a few years. Her life had not been easy, she said, but she had made peace with it. Ethan, in contrast, spoke about his career, about the empire he had built. But something in his voice shifted when he spoke of his business. There was no spark in his eyes when he described his day-to-day work. It was as though the words were rehearsed, delivered out of obligation rather than passion. Sophia caught that subtle shift, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized that she wasn't impressed by his wealth or accomplishments. She didn't seem to care about his status, and that was both disarming and oddly refreshing. "You've built something impressive," she said after he mentioned his business dealings, "but it sounds like you're missing something." Her tone was gentle, but there was a clarity in her words that made Ethan pause. He couldn't help but chuckle, slightly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure what you mean." Sophia didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about his childhood. Ethan had never been particularly open about his past, but there was something in the way she asked that made him answer honestly. He told her about his modest beginnings, about growing up in a working-class neighborhood, about how his family had always pushed him to achieve, to be better than everyone else around him. He told her how he'd moved away at 18, leaving home to pursue his dreams in the city. Sophia listened intently, but it was clear she wasn't simply hearing his words. She was absorbing the underlying emotion. She too had her own story, her own journey of resilience and survival. As a single mother, her life had been shaped by love and loss, by the constant balancing act of providing for her children and keeping her heart intact after a painful divorce. Her life had never been easy, but there was a quiet strength in her that Ethan admired, a no-nonsense approach to the complexities of her world. When they finally parted ways that evening, Ethan felt an unfamiliar tug of curiosity. He wanted to see her again, to understand more about the woman who could talk about her life with such honesty and self-awareness. Most women Ethan knew couldn't wait to talk about his success, about the way he had achieved everything they dreamt of. But Sophia wasn't like that. She didn't want anything from him. There was no agenda behind her smile, no calculation in her words. Before they said goodbye, Ethan asked her if he could call her sometime. She hesitated for just a moment, but then smiled warmly. "Sure, let's see where this goes," she replied. "But I warn you, my life's complicated. It's not the fairy tale you might be imagining." Ethan laughed. "I'm not looking for a fairy tale." And so, they parted ways, but the seed had been planted. As Ethan walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something deep inside him. It wasn't just the undeniable attraction he felt for Sophia, though that was certainly there. It was something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. He had built a life around business, around success, but here was a woman who didn't care about any of that. She cared about who he was at the core, not the facade he had so carefully constructed. And that was both exhilarating and terrifying. In the days that followed their initial meeting, Ethan found himself thinking about Sophia more than he expected. He had dated plenty of women over the years, but none of them had ever left him feeling the way she did. Like he was both seen and unseen at the same time. There was something in her eyes, something in the way she listened that made him feel as though he had to show up as his truest self, not the polished, perfect image he had so carefully cultivated. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to. Sophia was different from anyone he had ever known. Her independence was palpable, not in an abrasive way, but in a quiet strength. She was grounded in a way that Ethan had never fully understood. Her life wasn't shaped by the same forces of ambition that had driven him for years. She had carved out a life based on what truly mattered: her children, her work, and the delicate balance of making both work while also keeping her heart intact. When they began seeing each other more regularly, Ethan was introduced to the complexities of her life. Their dates, once simple outings to dinner or coffee, soon became complicated by the presence of her 3 children, Lily, Noah, and Emma. At first, Ethan thought he could juggle it all. Dating a woman with kids wasn't exactly new territory for him. But nothing could have prepared him for the full impact of the daily realities that came with being part of a blended family. Lily, the eldest at 15, was the most challenging. Ethan's first meeting with her had been awkward at best. She had barely said a word to him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Sophia had warned him that Lily could be distant, but Ethan hadn't realized how deeply the wounds of her parents' divorce ran. The way she looked at him, as if she were silently judging his worthiness, made him uncomfortable, though he refused to show it. Noah, 12, was more open but still hesitant. He had his moments of warmth, especially when Ethan took an interest in his video games or helped with a tricky math problem. But there was a subtle distance between them. Noah had always been the one who adjusted quickly, but the lingering effect of his parents' broken marriage still colored his interactions with Ethan. Emma, the youngest at 7, was the easiest to bond with. She would jump into Ethan's arms when he arrived, her innocent joy a sharp contrast to the older kid's wariness. He found himself looking forward to those moments of lightheartedness, where the pressures of being an adult faded away, if only for a few seconds. At first, Ethan wasn't sure how to handle the conflicting dynamics. He had always been the center of his own world, surrounded by people who admired his success, but never by people who needed him, truly needed him. His business partners had always respected his decisions, but none of them relied on him for emotional support. None of them were waiting for him to step in and fill the gaps that their own family had left behind. Sophia's children, on the other hand, were looking for someone who could guide them, love them, and show up when it mattered. But Ethan wasn't sure how to do that. He had no experience with parenting, no real idea of what it meant to be a steady presence in someone's life. He had spent so many years building a fortress around himself, carefully avoiding the very things that had the potential to make him vulnerable. But now he couldn't avoid it anymore. Sophia was kind, patient, and understanding, of course, but there were moments when Ethan saw her exhaustion. As much as she had it together in front of him, there were nights when she came home and collapsed on the couch, too tired to even make dinner, her eyes dark with the weight of everything she had to do. As a single mother, she was constantly juggling. "Sorry," she said one evening, after yet another long day. "I promised the kids we'd go to the park today, but I just can't. I'm so drained. You don't mind, do you?" Ethan looked at her, seeing the fatigue in her eyes. He knew the pressure she was under. "No, of course not," he replied, though part of him felt the sting of disappointment. He had been looking forward to spending time with her, but the reality of her life was something he hadn't fully understood yet. The kids came first, always. That night, after the children were in bed, Ethan stayed with Sophia on the couch. She didn't need grand gestures or expensive dates. What she needed was someone who could be present, someone who could hold space for her without needing anything in return. Ethan wasn't used to this kind of intimacy. In his past relationships, there had always been an underlying sense of transactional affection. But with Sophia, it was different. She laid her head on his shoulder, sighing softly. "I just feel like I'm constantly running on empty," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some days, I don't know if I can keep it all together. I try, I really do, but it's a lot." Ethan felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He wanted to fix it, to make her feel better. But he didn't have the answers. All he could do was be there. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. The more he spent time with Sophia, the more he understood that the act of showing up, of offering his presence without expecting anything in return, was the key to something much deeper. It wasn't just about fixing things. It was about supporting her, about learning to navigate the complexities of her life. And in doing so, he started to see how different their worlds were. Where he had been driven by an endless pursuit of success, she had been driven by an unyielding love for her children, a desire to create something lasting, something real. One evening, after a particularly difficult encounter with Lily, Ethan sat down with Sophia in the kitchen. The silence between them was thick, as though the weight of their unspoken thoughts hung in the air. "I'm not sure I can do this," Ethan confessed, his voice low. "I thought I could, but I don't know how to be what they need, especially Lily. She hates me." Sophia looked at him, her expression softening. "It's not about fixing it, Ethan. It's about being here, even when things are tough. Lily doesn't hate you. She's scared. She doesn't want anyone replacing her dad. But she'll come around. It just takes time." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy with the truth of her words. He had expected everything to fall into place quickly, but the reality of a blended family was far messier than he had anticipated. It wasn't a clean slate. It was a rebuilding process, one that required patience, understanding, and the willingness to put in the work. For the first time, Ethan realized that the work wasn't just about finding the right way to win over the kids. It was about confronting his own fears, his own limitations. And more than anything, it was about opening his heart to a future that was no longer just about him. The days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself increasingly immersed in Sophia's world. He spent more time at her apartment, helping with the children's homework, joining them for weekend outings, and even picking up groceries. The changes were subtle at first. He was still the same Ethan on the surface, successful, self-assured, always in control. But beneath that surface, a new kind of tension began to build inside him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Sophia's life was chaotic, unpredictable. There were days when the kids fought, when Lily slammed her bedroom door in frustration, or when Noah would retreat into his room with his headphones on, shutting out the world. Emma, the youngest, had her moments too, demanding attention at the most inopportune times. Ethan had always been the one to orchestrate his world, to make sure every detail was meticulously planned and executed. But now, the unscripted moments, the unpredictability of a family life he'd never been a part of, were starting to wear on him. At first, he told himself that he could handle it. After all, he'd handled much harder things in his career. Business deals, cutthroat competitors, financial risks. Those things were nothing compared to a few kids with emotional baggage, right? But as the weeks went by, it became clear that the emotional toll of this new reality was more than he'd bargained for. One particularly difficult evening, Ethan came over to Sophia's place after a long day at the office. He had barely stepped through the door when Lily, in one of her frequent rebellious moods, started arguing with him about something trivial. He couldn't even remember what it was about anymore, but her sharp words, the tension in her body, and the defensiveness in her eyes set him on edge. Sophia, already exhausted, tried to intervene, but Lily refused to listen, throwing herself into her room with a dramatic slam of the door. "Why are you always taking her side?" Ethan snapped at Sophia, his voice sharper than he intended. He had been holding in frustration for days, and it spilled out now as he turned to face her. Sophia's face tightened, her brow furrowing with the weight of the years she had spent managing the complex emotional landscape of her children's lives. "I'm not taking anyone's side, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice steady but tired. "I'm trying to hold this family together, and it's not always going to be easy. You can't just expect everything to fall into place because you walk in the door. This isn't a business deal. This is real life." Ethan's stomach tightened. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but he was frustrated with the constant emotional turbulence, frustrated with Lily's hostility, and frustrated with the sense that no matter how hard he tried, he wasn't quite enough for them. Not yet, at least. He looked away, trying to steady himself. "I don't know how to do this," he muttered, almost to himself. "I thought I could, but I don't know if I'm cut out for it." Sophia's expression softened, though the exhaustion in her eyes remained. She stepped closer to him, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. "You're trying," she said, her voice gentle. "And that's more than I can say for a lot of people. But this isn't going to be a smooth ride. It never is with kids, especially not when they've been through what they've been through. It's messy. It's painful. But it's worth it, Ethan. You're worth it." The words stung, but they also broke through the walls he'd built around himself. Ethan had never been good at vulnerability. He had always believed that success in life meant keeping control, never letting anyone see how much it cost to keep up the appearance of having it all together. But now, standing in Sophia's apartment, feeling the weight of her words, he realized how far he still had to go. For the first time, he acknowledged the truth he had been trying to suppress for weeks. He didn't just want to be a bystander in their lives. He didn't want to remain the distant boyfriend who showed up for dinner and left when things got too difficult. But to be a part of this family, to be the kind of partner Sophia needed, he had to be willing to let go of his old way of doing things, his way of maintaining control, his way of keeping everything neat and orderly. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. He was at a crossroads. His heart was torn between the man he had always been, the driven, self-sufficient businessman, and the man who was beginning to feel the pull of something more. Sophia and her children were pulling him into a world of messiness, of unpredictability, of imperfection. And while a part of him resisted, another part of him was beginning to want it, maybe even need it. He had spent so much of his life building a fortress of success, but now, the cracks in that fortress were becoming impossible to ignore. The reality of what it meant to be a part of this family, truly a part of it, was overwhelming. Sophia was a mother first, and no matter how much she cared about him, her children would always come first. And that meant that he would have to make space for them in ways he wasn't used to. But as the days passed, something shifted inside him. He found himself leaning into the discomfort, facing the challenges head-on instead of retreating into his old habits. He began to understand that love, true love, wasn't just about finding someone who made you feel good in the moment. It was about showing up, even when things were hard, even when you didn't have all the answers. Sophia noticed the change in him, the subtle shift in the way he interacted with her children. He started to engage more with Noah, offering to help with school projects or spending time talking about his interests. He made more of an effort with Lily, even when it seemed like she was rejecting him at every turn. And he found himself finding quiet moments with Emma, their simple exchanges bringing him a sense of peace that he hadn't realized he needed. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still moments of tension, moments when Lily's resistance felt like an impenetrable wall. But as time went on, Ethan realized that the struggle wasn't just about winning her over. It was about showing her that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was willing to fight for them, all of them. One evening, after another exhausting day, he sat with Sophia on the couch. The kids were in bed, and for the first time in weeks, the two of them had a moment to themselves. Sophia leaned her head on his shoulder, her breath slow and steady. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard those words in a long time, and they hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't used to being praised for simply showing up, for trying his best. "I'm trying," he replied quietly. "I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. For you. For them." Sophia smiled, her hand resting gently on his. That's all anyone can ask for. And in that moment, Ethan knew she was right. He wasn't perfect, but maybe for the first time in his life, that was enough. The months following the chaotic arrival of Ethan in Sophia's life were a whirlwind. At first, he had felt like an outsider, someone trying too hard to fit into a family that was still learning to trust him. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things had shifted. The sounds of laughter in the house, the spontaneous hugs from Emma, Noah's occasional jokes, and even the rare moments of warmth from Lily had begun to weave a new fabric of belonging around Ethan. He had thought that life with Sophia would be perfect, that he could sweep in like a hero and smooth over all the wrinkles in their lives. But life was messier than that. It was complicated, messy, and, at times, overwhelmingly difficult, especially with Lily. Her guardedness, her resistance to anyone who wasn't her biological father, had been a constant barrier. Yet Ethan had refused to give up on her, and though it hadn't been easy, he began to see the slow, quiet changes in her, small gestures of acceptance, like when she didn't immediately shut him out of conversations, or when she asked him to help with her math homework without the usual sarcasm. But one evening, everything shifted again. The phone call came just as Ethan was preparing to leave for an important meeting. Sophia's voice was tight with panic. Lily had run away. Again, Ethan had been in this position before, standing on the edge of crisis, feeling the tremors of fear and uncertainty. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just a fleeting problem with Lily. This was the crux of what he had been afraid of from the start. Could he really step into the role of father figure, of partner, of protector when it mattered most? He dropped everything and rushed to Sophia's side. He could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion that came from trying so hard to hold everything together, to be both a mother and a provider, to be everything for her children. His heart broke for her in that moment. "Sophia, we'll find her," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "You're not alone. We'll do this together." They spent hours searching, calling friends, checking the places Lily usually went when she needed to be alone. But there was no sign of her. It was the first time Ethan truly understood the weight of what Sophia had been carrying for years. her love for her children, and the unbearable fear of losing them. When they finally got the call that Lily had been found, it was a mix of relief and dread. She was safe, but shaken, sitting on a park bench, alone in the dark. They rushed to the park, Ethan's heart pounding in his chest. When they arrived, Lily sat there, arms wrapped around herself, eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. Sophia approached her first, her voice soft, but filled with the authority of a mother who had fought for her child's love for years. "Lily," she said gently, kneeling in front of her, "I'm so sorry you feel this way. I know I haven't been perfect, but I need you to understand that I'm not here to replace your father. I'm here because I love you. I'm here because I want to be part of your life, and I want to help you, no matter how hard it gets." Lily's eyes were hard. Her jaw clenched as if she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at her mother, then at Ethan, who had stepped forward quietly, standing at a distance, unsure how to bridge the gap between them. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Lily, I'm not trying to take anyone's place," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm here now. I'm here for you, for your mom, for this family. I can't promise I'll always know the right thing to say or do, but I'm not going anywhere. And I'm willing to earn your trust, if you'll let me." Lily's face softened, just slightly, the hardness in her eyes faltering. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance, at least not yet. But it was something else, a small crack in the wall she had built up around herself. Sophia reached out for her daughter, her voice trembling. "We're going to take this one step at a time, sweetheart. But you're not alone. None of us are." For a long moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that spoke louder than any words could. But slowly, Lily stood up, wiping her eyes, and without a word, walked into her mother's arms. Ethan stood back, giving them the space they needed. He knew this was a beginning, not an end. This wasn't the moment where everything was fixed, but it was a step forward. The following months were not without their struggles, but slowly, the cracks in the family's foundation began to fill with something stronger: understanding. Lily still had her moments of resistance, but there were fewer of them now. She had learned to trust, little by little, that her family wasn't going to give up on her, no matter how hard she pushed. Ethan found himself learning to let go of his fears of imperfection. He realized that this family wasn't perfect, that no one had all the answers. But what they had was something real, a deep, raw, and messy love that wove them all together. Sophia, too, had grown. She had seen how far Ethan was willing to go for her and her children, how he had chosen to show up, even when it wasn't easy. She had learned to lean into his support, not as a crutch, but as a partner. Together, they were learning to navigate the unpredictable path of blending their lives, of creating a family in their own unique way. One evening, as they sat down to dinner together, a rare but treasured family moment, Ethan looked around the table at the people who had slowly, but surely, become his world. There was laughter, even a bit of chaos, as Noah and Emma bickered over who got to choose the movie for after dinner. But it was in these moments, in the soft hum of everyday life, that Ethan found his peace. It wasn't in the grand gestures or the perfect milestones. It was in the messy, imperfect moments they shared. Those were the moments that mattered. Sophia reached across the table, taking his hand, and for the first time, Ethan didn't need any words to express how he felt. He had found his place, not in the world of wealth and status that he once thought mattered, but in the messy, beautiful reality of family. He wasn't the hero he once thought he had to be. He was simply someone who had learned that love wasn't about fixing everything. It was about showing up, again and again, and that, he realized, was enough. That's all, guys. Hope you enjoyed, and I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.